Welcome to Open Minds, a freedom of thought podcast series, interviewing the people who bring courage and independent thought to the challenges of today.
Well, hello, Randy Barnett. Welcome back to the Freedom of Thought podcast and videocast. My name's Josh Kleinfeld. I'm the Allison and Dorothy Rouse Professor of Law at George Mason Scalia Law. And my guest today, folks, is Randy Barnett, the Patrick Hotung Professor of Law at Georgetown Law School. And Randy, we've spoken on this podcast before, which was one of the most interesting conversations I've ever recorded on any podcast. Today, we're talking about your latest book, A Life for Liberty, The Making of an American Originalist. And this one is different from your past books. You got a lot of books. Most of them are works of scholarship. This one is a memoir. And I've spent the last few days reading it. And besides the many fascinating points and moments of wisdom and insight, it's just a great read. I just want to tell you to start with, it's fun. It's long, but each individual chapter is short. They're delightfully written. They're sort of breezy. They're often funny. And there's a sense of joie de vivre, which just breathes out of every page. And so I just want to start today with a recommendation for our listeners and viewers. The book's available for $30 today on Amazon. You can get it in Kindle or hardcover. And I can't recommend it enough. It's a delight to read, and it's really engaging and really educational. So I wanted to start with that.
Well, let me interrupt by thanking you profusely for this compliment. When you spend a couple of years of your life writing a book like this, it's a very personal statement. You really get worried about what the response is going to be. It seems it could be taken as very self-indulgent, and obviously, in some respects, it really is self-indulgent. And so you don't know what the response of strangers, or we're not strangers, but people who are not part of your immediate family are going to be to such a personal work. And so to hear your response, even though we are friends, it's still nevertheless, you're a critical friend, and it's nevertheless wonderful to hear. But before we go on, I do want to congratulate you on your promotion, your elevation from Northwestern Law School to George Mason Law School, the Scalia Law School. Last time I was here, you were struggling at Northwestern, that pitiful place. No, I don't mean that. that problematic place. I have a chapter on Northwestern law in the book. We're not going to go there today, but my views on Northwestern law are made clear in the book in various places. Spoiler alert: there were twice that they turned me down for a job there, and so it's the whole story behind that. But now you've gotten to a great place, Scalia Law School.
Thanks, Randy. I really appreciate it. I mean, what I said about the book is sincerely meant. I just loved reading it, and I think others will love reading it. But thank you for the compliment. Last time I introduced myself on this podcast, it was as a professor of law at Northwestern Law School. I spent 13 years there, and now I've made the big move, and I'm got this endowed chair at George Mason, Scalia Law, and I'm happier than I've been in a really long time.
It's good to see you happy.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, friend. So let's talk through some of your story and some questions that arose for me as I read it. And I wanted to start with the question of why write a memoir? Professors don't usually write memoirs. We try to do something, I think, that contributes to the world and that even stands the test of time. And we do that with our scholarship, our teaching, and our contributions to the institution. But our daily life is one of contemplation, not action. And so it doesn't always translate to a good memoir, and most people don't attempt it. And of course, there's always the risk of being thought egotistical for attempting one. So I just want to start with why you wrote it. What was the motivation?
The initial motivation happened as a result of having my first grandchild. And so since he's 8 years old now, it gives you an idea of when this idea was planted in my head, because I knew that in my career, I had done so many different and varied things besides what you attribute to we as scholars. Yeah. And that it would be, I thought my grandchild, and now I have 5 grandchildren, the most recent one is 3 weeks old, would someday want to know what their grandfather did. But I wouldn't be around to tell them, or even if I was still around to tell them, they wouldn't sit still long enough to hear all the stories that I have. So I basically started off the project just memorializing my life for their purpose, for them, and I didn't necessarily intend to publish it. At the best, I thought maybe I'd self-publish it. Mm-hmm. But in the course of writing it, I realized that my story not only contained certain lessons that I will be happy to talk about shortly, but it was also the story of 2 big intellectual movements because of my participation in them to some degree almost from day one. and that is the libertarian political movement, in particular the theoretical movement, not so much the political partisan Libertarian Party stuff. But I got very involved in the libertarian political movement, as we'll talk about. And then it was the conservative, constitutional conservative movement, of which originalism plays a major role. So I've been in both of these movements since almost when they started. And my career and the arc of my career has been deeply enmeshed in the development of both of these movements. So it's almost a first-person narrative of two very important political movements. And from the inside, it's an insider's view as well, I can reveal lots of things about, constitutional cases and other things that were going on. At the same time, in the course of writing it, I realized that there were lessons to be learned from my story, lessons I learned. Number one, my story is a story of mentorship. As much as the places I lived, it's a story of starting with my mentor, my father, from whom I got my political principles, and I know that's from whom you got your political principles, and I know your father, wonderful man, great man, your father and my father, to my grade school band instructor, who was a very, very big lib, so to speak, and would love to argue with me politically, as he was as liberal as my father was conservative. Moving on to my high school debate coach, and then my philosophy professor in college, who was a natural law, Aristotelian Thomist natural law theorist, and then Murray Rothbard, a libertarian movement, and then and on from there. I did an independent study with Ronald Dworkin. Each one of these relationships made me the person I am. Now, from knowing me even before this book, that I am, in some sense, a moral individualist. I think the individual is the unit of value. I'm an Aristotelian Thomist who believes the individual is the unit of value. On the other hand, I believe we're social animals, and we wouldn't be who we are without other people. And this is a book that is a tribute to these other people, even though that's not what I set out to write. That is what happened.
Sounds like you set out to write a book for your grandkids and then realized you were writing a tribute to some people who meant a great deal to you in your life, sort of recording of some lessons you'd learned in your life, and the story of these two important movements, the originalist movement or the constitutional conservative movement and the libertarian movement. And I mean, at that point, you've got something to offer the world. And so what you offer as a gift to your grandkids becomes something you can offer others as well.
Thanks. And along the way, some unexpected things happen. Like I get to be in a feature film, portray a proxy in a feature film filmed in LA, the soundstage with a bunch of sci-fi actors that I had watched on television, and Star Trek and Deep Space and Battlestar Galactica. There were these. So there's some good stories. There's some fun stories that have been along the way.
Yeah, that's that sense of joie de vivre that comes out, and it really wasn't the life, and we'll talk more about the details, but it wasn't a life just of sitting in your office contemplating like Immanuel Kant, and eventually writing the Critique of Pure Reason. It was a life of engagement and contemplation, and the two are in constant interplay with each other. So let's start with your early life. It's a theme. We start here with a theme that's going to come up again and again for me as your interviewer, and I'm proud to say your friend as well. 30 years separates us, but the parallels between our lives are uncanny. And it starts with childhood. So you grew up in Calumet, Illinois. Did I say it right?
Calumet City.
Calumet City, Illinois. It's a working class Christian town. And you never quite fit in. You came from a Jewish but not observant family. It sounds like your family, your dad in particular, were quite intellectual but not highly educated. And you had a father who was contrarian and had conservative, libertarian leanings, and who just loved to talk about ideas. So most people, they go where they fit. It's natural for human beings to do that. Most people make the choice to identify a place where there are other people like them and go there so that they can fit in. But your dad, he didn't care. He didn't care. The social world was just not that important to him. Fitting in was not that important to him.
Yeah, the reason we ended up there is because he had a business on the south side of Chicago, and they were building out the interstate highway system, and the Calumet Expressway, which was I-94, ended, at 159th Street at that point, and that's where Calumet City was. So that was the farthest, because the house prices were less as you drove farther away from Chicago. That was the farthest away you could get on the expressway. And so 159th Street, you get off and there's Calumet City, and that's where he bought a house.
Which is not, most Jewish people from that part of Chicago were moving to Skokie or something.
They're moving
like
to
that.
the west side, or they're moving to the north side. Nobody was moving to the south side, but my dad, the contrarian, always did something different.
You were also academically gifted in a grade school and a high school where academic giftedness was not the coin of the realm. Sports was the coin of the realm. So for me, I don't want to focus on myself too much, but just because these parallels are amazing, I grew up in Fairbanks, Alaska. It's a working class Christian town. My world as a kid was guns, trucks, and churches. That's what's in Fairbanks. And a Jewish but not observant family, intensely intellectual. There's a bit of a generational difference because my parents were the children of parents like yours, but they themselves were highly educated. So I grew up in an educated family that had me pointed to Ivy League colleges from the jump. But still,
whereas I didn't know where Northwestern was. When my high school guidance counselor told me my SAT scores were good enough to get a Northwestern, I said, really? Where's that?
Yeah, I thought that was really amusing. And of course, it's just in Evanston. It's part of your state. But my dad also a contrarian, conservative, libertarian who just didn't care about being a social outsider. And to this day, my parents are in Fairbanks, Alaska, and they're kind of social outsiders, and that's okay. They don't mind that. There's a feeling in that kind of childhood. It starts in childhood, but it never quite leaves, of not quite fitting. You're in your hometown, but you're not quite of it because you don't fully fit. And then as we'll get to, you go to elite colleges and law schools and...
Well, you left out that we had a Jewish community on the other side of the state line. I was on the Illinois side at the low-rent D-Class A Calumet City. And on the other side, Hammond, Indiana, were the Jews from Hammond and Munster and East Chicago. And they were all big libs, all big progressives, we would say today.
Yeah.
And they were also, were more upscale economically than anybody in Calumet City. And so I was also not, I also didn't quite fit in there. I didn't quite fit in two different places for different reasons.
And this becomes a lifetime experience. I mean, going to Northwestern College, as we get to in Harvard Law School, this constant feeling of sort of not quite fitting. And so I just want to start with that. Invite you to talk about what Calumet means to you. I don't sense any sort of alienation or bitterness. Actually, it sounds like it was a pretty great childhood.
I'm grateful.
And how it affected you, but also to talk about the costs and benefits of this perennial outsider status that, one has being academically gifted, but coming from that part of the country and then leaving that part of the country for elite institutions and not quite fitting in there either. So let me just invite you to talk about both those things.
Right. Well, I am very grateful to have grown up in Calumet City. It's really part of what we would call the real world. And my friends were, sort of real world people. I go back to the reunions, every reunion I can make. I was at the 50th reunion, which had been postponed because of COVID. So instead it was entitled Class of 70, Turn 70. Mm-hmm. So there were all these elderly people who were my classmates. And I couldn't tell you how much it meant to me that whoever was organizing the conference, like a day or two before, said, we'd like if you'd say a few words of welcome to the group. I'm thinking, they're asking me to say a few words of welcome to them. Now, I was president of student council. That's kind of where it was, but it normally would be the class president who would do it. But he passed away, so it fell to me, and they asked me. I never would have presumed to do it. And then I got up in front of them. I tell this story in the memoir. I get up in front of them, and I was actually kind of nervous to stand up in front of them. And, and I told them, I said, look, I've tried jury. I had this prepared, but I didn't want to sound self-aggrandizing. But I've tried murder trials to juries, and I've argued in the Supreme Court. But I have to say, I'm nervous just talking to you folks, And then some woman called out from the group, you don't have to be. and it was because they were them. They were my childhood right there. And I'm very grateful to them. They were good and decent people, and they were good and decent to me. as well. I did have some incidents of anti-Semitism growing up, which has made a deep impression on me. I grew up believing the Jews were not in the majority, we were in a deep, small minority, and that the idea that it can't happen here, my dad ingrained in me, it can happen anywhere. And if it does happen anywhere, they won't care if you're observant or not observant, or if you've given it up or not. You're going to be Jewish, and they're going to get you. So I was completely attuned to what's happening today. This is not a big shock for me. It's a shock for people who grow up in majority Jewish or plurality Jewish neighborhoods like Scarsdale or like Skokie or et cetera. I think those Jews get a misleading version of what it is to be Jewish in this world. That was very important. But it also meant I was kind of on the outs. There were 4 Jews in my graduating class of 400, to give the listeners a sense. And over on the Jewish side of things, I was a conservative, and everybody there was progressives, and I was from the economically wrong side of the tracks. But here's the thing: I was socially successful in both milieus. I was the president of my ACA chapter. I pitched softball for the team. I was president of student council. I was on the carnival court, which is kind of a mini popularity contest. Even though I didn't think of myself that way, in hindsight, I obviously was pretty social successful. At any rate, it gave me a foundation. When I became a prosecutor and my job was to deal with cops and to deal with suspects and to argue to jurors who are also ordinary people, it enabled me to speak to them because I grew up with them and respect them. So it actually was of great assistance to me when I was a trial lawyer. And intellectually, as you've already remarked, and as we discussed just before we went on air, I was told once by Murray Rothbard, a very important libertarian thinker, that most people who are intellectuals become intellectuals because when they grow up, they're not entirely of the place they grew up at. And as a result of that, they see the world somewhat detached. It's like a fish who doesn't understand they're in water. But if you're like out of water, then you can kind of see the water. And as a result, intellectuals are evaluating their environment in a way that would lead to ideas and writings and theories, et cetera, whereas somebody who's completely immersed and completely accepted, they're just too content to do that sort of thing. Another example, when I went into the criminal justice system, and all of my stories about when I was a prosecutor are going to be in my next book called Felony Review, Fighting Crime and Corruption in Chicago. When I went there, all the people around me who were great lawyers and people who I learned from, they just took the system as it was for granted. But because I had this intellectual background, I'd already published in Ethics, a philosophy journal, my critique of criminal justice, I could kind of look at the criminal justice system and sort of check it out. And they weren't doing that. They were just living life the way normal people do. And me, intellectual me, I'm, in addition to living life the way they're doing it and being fully immersed in the system, I'm also evaluating the system as I go through life. And that's kind of been how my life has been.
I think I share all those views and agree with them. I would just say a lot of intellectuals, what sets them apart is they were smart and good at school. They're not particularly interesting minds.
Can we say a lot of academics?
A lot of academics or academic types, academic adjacent.
Whether they're really intellectuals?
But genuine intellectuals, people who are really contemplating the world they live in and trying to understand it from the foundations. It helps to be a little bit of an outsider so that, as you say, you can be the fish who's not entirely in the water, can kind of see the water that everyone else is just swimming in. I think of this one acquaintance of mine who he grew up in sort of the elite progressive circles of California, and then he went to the elite progressive circles of Stanford, and then the elite progressive circles of Oxford, and then the elite progressive circles of Yale, and then the elite progressive circles of several other stops along the way. And he's at ease in the world. He's completely comfortable in the world he now occupies, as he has been every day of his life. But I've never seen him utter an interesting thought, because maybe you don't have one to utter. The other thing that strikes me as really significant about that is the views which he holds are the views everyone he's ever known around him to hold. And so there's this sense of what the French call the bien passant, I think is how they pronounce it. I probably mangled that, but it means the views of the good and educated people. And those just become sort of part of your milieu. Whereas if you come, as I do, from Fairbanks, Alaska, or come as you do from Calumet, Illinois, and then enter into this world, well, you have some detachment from the views that everyone around you accepts.
Absolutely. Now, one of the things that you probably wouldn't have asked me, but I'm going to volunteer now, there's somebody who's a contrarian and somebody who is sort of not 100% fitting into the group, and then made a career writing about stuff that is not in the mainstream. I also have a psychological or emotional weakness, and that is I want to be accepted.
Yeah.
Now, not everybody who's iconoclastic cares about being accepted. Some people actually affirmatively don't want to be accepted. But unfortunately, I consider this to be a weakness of mine. I kind of want acceptance. And so if you're a contrarian, that's not the best way to go about getting accepted. Dwarier's your friend. He's perfectly accepted because he has all acceptable views. I go into academia with, in some cases, disreputable views, like a view that the Ninth Amendment to the Constitution should mean something, and it's not something that is a disreputable topic. So I have all these, and the Second Amendment should protect individual right, which at that time was also disreputable. I have all these disreputable views, and yet I do at some level crave acceptance, which is a bad thing. But one of the things that's kind of nice about my career that I can say now at the age of 72 is that I never deviated from my belief in my statement of what I believe to be true, regardless of whether it was conventional or not, conventional thinking or not. And by and large, I've been accepted. That is, I've been accepted in the world of Georgetown, in the elite world of Supreme Court litigators. I mean, I do feel that I've accomplished the kinds of acceptance that I was looking for, even though I don't necessarily advise people who care to be accepted to do it the way I was doing it.
Right. It was actually, that's a wonderful transition to your college experience. Why don't we go there now? As you mentioned earlier, growing up, you had never heard of the elite colleges, or you had heard of them, but they didn't seem to be part of your possibility realm growing up. But you got great scores on the SAT, and guidance counselor told you could go to Northwestern. And there is a real difference between our stories. My parents were academically ambitious Jewish parents who raised me from the jump to go to an elite school. And I remember my childhood friend saying, "Josh, why do you have to go to an Ivy League college? I never even heard of the Ivy League until I became friends with you." And I remember saying to them, "I don't know. I just don't know. It's just like the sun rising. It has to happen." But then our stories intersect again in an interesting way, because when you got to Northwestern, you essentially encountered the coastal social elite, what we now call coastal elites.
Did I ever?
For the first time. And there were a set of political attitudes which were, at the time they were called liberal, now we'd probably call them progressive. They were quite anti-patriotic. That was part of the badge of membership. And indeed, the whole network of political, there was a social style to it, but there was also a set of political views that really were part of the social style. I mean, the political views weren't held at sort of, these are my convictions about how the economy works or something like that. They were political views that were a badge of membership in a certain social class. And there's a complex relationship between class membership and political ideology in that context. I remember this vividly from my own encounter with Yale College, right? So I grew up in Fairbanks, Alaska. I go to Yale College, and I'm in a seminar. And I don't remember what the provocation was, but I remark, "Well, that would be awful. That's socialism." And the students around me were dumbfounded. And afterwards, one of them roundly mocked me for thinking that socialism means something bad as opposed to something good. And I became aware for the first time.
It just means we share with
others.
Right,
it just means we're sharing.
We're just sharing. That's what the vice presidential nominee now thinks.
Indeed. And I remember realizing that the word socialism is a good thing in that milieu, in that class milieu. So one thing that comes out of the book is you really did not like those folks, those coastal elites.
It was very personal. This is something completely over and above running into people in classes or even at the cafeteria. This was my roommate, and his friends. So I got stuck with a roommate from Scarsdale, who actually I think on his own would have been a perfectly okay roommate. But he had a best friend, I won't use his name, from Scarsdale. They were best friends from high school, and the two of them together were real jerks. If you've ever seen the movie MASH, which is, an old movie. And by the way, this is 1970, so the Vietnam War is currently happening, and MASH comes out in 1970.
It's a show, right? Isn't it?
Well, it was
serial?
a TV show, but I'm talking about the movie.
Okay.
That comes out in Robert Altman. It comes out in 1970, and it's supposedly about the Korean War, but it's really about the Vietnam War. And there's these two main characters, Hawkeye and Trapper John. Trapper John played by Elliot Gould, and Hawkeye played by Donald Sutherland. And I'm telling you, my roommate was a lot like Donald Sutherland, and his buddy was almost a Stead Ringer for Elliot Gould. In fact, I think he grew out the Fu Manchu mustache because of the movie. And the two of them in the movie were tormenting Frank Burns because he was this middle-class, patriotic guy. And then they also tormented the nurse that they nicknamed Hot Lips Houlihan because she was a straight, patriotic person. And so I was their Frank Burns. And the movie came out, and I think it really egged them on, frankly, because everybody watched that movie. And by the way, I mean, Elliot Gould and Donald Sutherland characters are supposed to be the good guys in this movie, but go watch that movie now. They are the bad guys.
Yeah. The
stars of that movie are the bad guys. Anyway, what they were doing to Frank Burns is what those guys were doing to me. That was very personal. But it was political. And then the other thing is I had a television set, and I like watching television, which is another motif of my entire life up until today. I became a lawyer because of television. And they hated that. It was a class thing. No one's supposed to like television, but I did.
Huh. That takes me by surprise. But what struck me about the story, and I think that story, much as it's a very personal one about your roommates, it has universal elements. I mean, I experienced something like it when I came as a middle-class kid from Fairbanks, Alaska to your college and encountered this kind of coastal elite and found myself thinking, this is really weird and I don't approve and they don't entirely approve of me. I think a lot of our listeners and viewers might have encountered something similar. Maybe they're devoutly religious and they're encountering a very irreligious community of people at their elite institutions. And when you encounter that, when anyone encounters that, there's a choice between social belonging and integrity. And social belonging is very, very tempting, particularly when you're 18 to 22 and away from home, and it's really desirable to have social belongings, but the costs in terms of integrity are high as well. So I thought I'd invite you to talk about that choice between social belonging and integrity and this kind of chapter in your life. How did you experience that encounter with a social elite whose progressive politics are part of their social class? And what do you make of it now, I guess about 50 years later? What do you recommend to people who are dealing with that integrity, social belonging trade-off now?
Well, first of all, I think we can assume or make a considered judgment or prediction that if you're listening to this podcast, you have grown up in circumstances similar to yours and similar to mine. Everybody's circumstances will be different, but this idea of being on the edge or being on the outs or having a trade-off between social belonging and your own political convictions, almost everybody who listens to this podcast is going to share. Yeah. Not that many completely conventional-minded people are going to be fans of this podcast. So we're all in this together. We all have our, it's not really, we all have our individual versions of this story, but it's the same story. And the way, I dealt with it was, first of all, I tried to associate with people who were good people. And I have been very blessed in my life that I think I've been a pretty good judge of people's characters to be my friends. I mean, these guys I was talking about, they were never my friends. I was stuck with them. But I made friends. I made a very good friend, Jeanette DeWise, when I was a first year at Northwestern, who ultimately coached me through my philosophy classes. She was a journalism major, but she took all the same philosophy classes with me, and she helped me study for the exam, and I don't think I would have even gotten the grades I got if it hadn't been for her. And she's the one that introduced me to libertarianism, and she became a reporter at the San Diego Reader. She's still around, so I made good friends, and that's what you do. You make good friends, and here's what you have to get over, and this is what I learned in high school. In high school, I wanted to be in the in crowd, and so I hung out with the in crowd, and I didn't hang out with the people who were not in the in crowd. And I was always marginal socially within the in crowd and never really belonged there because I wasn't a jock and all the rest. So that did not make for a happy life. But about halfway through, or nearly my senior year, I finally made friends with one of the four other Jewish kids in my high school, who became my best friend and who is still my best friend. Other than Larry Solom, I have two best friends, Larry Solom and Jay Blackburn. He went on to become a dentist, and he now is retired and he lives in Alabama. But I put aside the in-crowd business and went with a really good guy who I'm friends with till today. And so I think that's how most people deal with it. If you need to make good friends, and it's your friends against everybody else at that point, and that's the base to operate on. And the other thing which relates to my career, and that is, no matter what other people are saying, you have to always say what you think is true, and not lie, and not misrepresent your views. You can keep your views to yourself. Discretion is the better part of valor many, many times. But you should never utter falsehoods, things that you know to be false, in order to get along with everybody. And I think if you're going to be a professional academic or an intellectual, that's the first rule. Maybe the first rule is be decent to people in your life. The second rule is to never knowingly utter a falsehood. Everything you say, you must believe to be true when you say it.
So integrity plus friendship was my equation too. You can kind of endure an alienating social environment if you have people who you love and who love you, if you have good friends around you, and then it's okay. You can cope with it, and you can cope with it without losing your integrity.
This is what the Federalist Society did. There was no Federalist Society when I was in law school, so I was completely on my own in a 140-person section, which is what the size was at Harvard Law School. I had no idea if anyone else in the section agreed with me or didn't. Merrick Garland was in my section. He never agreed with me. I didn't know who else might agree with me. But once you had a Federalist Society, founded 5 years later, all you had to do was attend a Federalist Society meeting, and then you go back to your section and you can look around the room and you go, oh, yeah, there's that guy, that guy, that guy, that guy. We don't have to say anything, but we can make eye contact with each other. And that's your
social milieu.
That's your social milieu.
I always found that my friendships were scattered. Some people agreed with me politically, some people emphatically did not. There was an element of personal trust in chemistry that transcended politics. I think that's becoming less true. I think that in today's law schools, there is a social dividing line between the different political tribes. I had an experience recently. I was quite honored, actually. Two of my former Northwestern students fell in love and got engaged and asked me to be the officiant at their wedding. And I went to New York. They were very busy with their law firm careers, and so I really had to write the ceremony and go up there and marry them and reflect on my own experiences of married love and what that means. And so I performed the ceremony. It was a wonderful occasion. It was really touching for me. It was great to have my family in the audience watching it. There were about 12 of my former students at that wedding, and every single one was in the Federalist Society. Because I think those social barriers have become very, very difficult to cross. And that brings me to my next question. It's a two-parter, I guess. Why is the American social elite like this? Why is it the experience of people who are heterodox thinkers, religious, libertarian, conservative, politically, and whatever else, or just from middle-class America, why do they find themselves so at odds with the coastal elites, politically, ideologically, but also culturally? And what's the lesson of this experience? Is the lesson that we need to make sure that our elite institutions are porous and there are ways in for these social outsiders? Or is the lesson that we need to build new institutions where people can find each other and not be kind of captured by the elite?
Probably in terms of the lesson is a little bit of both, or we need multi-phase strategy. But as to the first, I don't know that I've worked out a view of any of this. It's a kind of a question of first impression of why they're like this. First of all, it's not new. There have always been religious establishments. Religious establishments get some satisfaction out of persecuting heretics. And heretics are worse than people who are outside the faith entirely, really. Yeah. They're harder on heretics than they are on people who are just disbelievers or never were part of the group in the first place, which is true of the left going after going after liberals, worse than they go after us in some respects. And so this is the way a religious hierarchy works. And for many people, their politics, their ideology is their religion. and because it makes them feel moral and good and right, and a lot of them, unfortunately, equate being a good person with being a politically correct person. And in fact, some of the worst people that you and I have probably ever worked with, in terms of how they treat staff, how they treat people subordinate to them, are some of the most progressive people that we've worked with. And I don't think that's an accident. That is, they view in some respects, I think maybe even appreciating what bad people they are. They correct for that by adopting all the right positions, and therefore they make them moral. Now, most everybody's not that bad, but I know I've seen egregious cases of this. And so because these ideological views have taken on a religious dimension, all the consequences of religious strife, we are now experiencing the consequences of religious strife. That is what led John Locke and others to advocate for toleration. Toleration was the way to end all this civil acrimony. And that's what is now being dismissed by the left as being somehow makes you complicit if you tolerate that which is evil. This is all a reemergence of a religious war, I think.
This dovetails with my next question, which is about your intellectual development in college at that time. So you studied philosophy for the first time in college.
Never heard of it before. Had no idea there was such a thing.
And when you came to college, you declared as a political science major and then transitioned into philosophy because of the influence of this great teacher, John Veitch.
Henry
Did I say that right?
Henry Veitch,
right. Who was Aristotelian and was intensely concerned with natural rights. And to be clear, at this point in your life, you weren't a libertarian. You'd never heard that term. You didn't represent yourself that way. You were quite taken with this kind of Aristotelian Aquinas combination that you were encountering.
And still am.
Can you talk about what, those are just labels. Can you talk about which ideas moved you at this time and why?
Sure. Well, I mean, I grew up a political conservative. I would be what you would call a William F. Buckley conservative. I favored Nixon over Kennedy. And when I was 12 years old, I debated on behalf of Barry Goldwater in front of my entire junior high school and grade school class, several hundred students sitting in chairs in the school gymnasium. And I even have my debate notes. So in the book, I'm able actually to literally say verbatim what I said in my closing argument in this debate for Barry Goldwater. So I was a very hardcore Republican conservative Republican in the Buckley tradition. I watched Firing Line, which, there was very little for us to consume by way of political views, but I did all that. And then I got to college but why? Why was that so appealing to me? It's the same reason I decided.
Well, not just the conservatism, but the Aristotle Aquinas.
Haven't got there yet.
Oh, okay.
So why was all this? Why was I so interested in politics and these political things? It's the same reason I became a lawyer. It's because I had a deep commitment to justice. And that's the reason why when the television show called The Defenders came on TV when I was 10 years old, and it was a show about a father-son criminal defense team in New York, very realistic, filmed in black and white, on location a lot, not about solving murders, which is what Perry Mason had been about, which didn't interest me at all. But it was about being a lawyer defending people who were innocent and guilty, and all the ethical challenges of a lawyer. I looked at that on TV. I said, well, that's what I want to be. Now, the reason I wanted to do that, I now know in hindsight, is because my overriding value, my overriding commitment is to justice and to see the world a more just place. And it's injustice that just completely, gets me going. And it's the reason why I'm unhappy in days, because I run in, I'm on X and I see all these injustices and it makes me mad. So that's my motivating thing. Now, I didn't know until I got to college, because of my high school, that there was actually a field, a discipline, that people actually wrote about justice. What is it? Mm-hmm. I mean, I didn't know anything about that. I didn't know that people wrote about this, and it was called philosophy. I started off as a political science major because I was interested in politics. Mm-hmm. Turns out political science isn't about politics. It's about statistics, it's about opinion surveys and whatever the quants are into, not political theory. And then, for whatever reason, I took an intro to philosophy class. Luckily, this is actually an argument for the quarter system, because I could take I had 3 quarters. In the first quarter, I was a political science. The second quarter, I took intro to philosophy from a guy named John Fairchild, who was a grad student. And he taught it with the problem method. And we were all given these ethical problems, and we were supposed to solve them. I still have some of my papers from that. And I thought, oh my God, I can't believe there's people study this. You can get a grade. I mean, I couldn't believe it. So I switched to a philosophy major. And my third quarter, I took ethics with Henry Veitch, who was a natural law Aristotelian Thomist, philosopher. And here we are. It's a theory of the good that made perfect sense to me. The idea of human flourishing, the idea that we have human natures and there are things that are good for us and there are things that are bad for us, just as there are things that are good for the acorn and bad for the acorn. And the acorn is meant to grow into an oak tree, and the thing that's good for the acorn are the conditions necessary to make it grow into an oak tree. And human beings are real creatures, and we have a nature just like other creatures have a nature. And there are things that are good for us and things that are bad for us. And this completely appealed to me. Now, it wasn't a political program. This was an ethical program. I was still just a political conservative. The thing didn't translate into politics. That came when I was exposed to libertarianism, which came in my junior year of college.
Before we get there, so what you just described with this, comprehensive conception of the good based on the nature of a thing and a thing's being able to realize its nature, people who have read philosophy in our audience will recognize that as an Aristotelian thought. And by the way, it was an Aristotelian thought I found completely arresting when I got to college as a freshman. I was a music composition major, and also an economics major who switched into philosophy after I encountered Aristotle and that exact idea and found it completely magnetic and completely persuasive. And frankly, I still do.
Me too. I'm still an Aristotelian Thomist.
What was the
which
Thomist
is
part of it?
within the conservative movement? That's a big deal because
Yes.
everything has started to circle around, coming back to that again. And people who are in that circling around process might look at me and say, "Well, I'm the other. I'm certainly on the outs from them." And it turns out not only am I not on the outs from them, I was there first, and I have never changed. And so this is somewhat of a welcome development to me. Now I do think that rights play a role in human flourishing, which Henry Veitch did not think when he was my professor, but eventually came around to that view and published a very interesting book called Human Rights, Fact or Fancy that came out in 1987, which I highly recommend. You can buy it on Amazon.
Now, Aristotle doesn't talk about rights. That's
No,
not a
exactly.
focus, even
And
in his politics.
Terrific.
He doesn't talk about rights.
Absolutely. And Henry was an Aristotelian, so he didn't talk about rights either. And when I went to him and I started talking to him about natural rights, it was like I had, farted in church or something. I mean,
Was that the Thomist part of the Aristotle Aquinas connection, the focus on natural rights?
No.
Natural law?
I didn't get natural rights out of that. I got natural rights when I became a libertarian.
So let's go there then. You had this, it was actually wonderful to read, this experience in college of starting to hear from your best friend about libertarianism and then having conversations about it.
And
that
telling
eventually-
her, I don't want to hear about this. And the reason I didn't want to hear about it was because I thought the name, the label libertarian sounded weird. And, and speaking of weird, everything's weird. It sounded weird to me, and I just said, "Don't buy." She went to a YAF convention with the boyfriend who she married, and came back, and the YAF convention was riven between the traditionalists and the libertarians, and she was going to try to tell me about this, and libertarians sounded weird to me. Don't bother with me, Janet. I don't want to hear about it, Jeanette. And the only reason I ended up being exposed to it is because we ended up living in my junior year in a philosophy and religion residential college at Northwestern. We were in the same dorm, and she invited this libertarian junior professor named John Cody to talk to our group, and I went to the program because it was happening in my dorm, and I'm listening to him discuss libertarianism, and I'm sitting there thinking, at last, this is a rational conservatism.
Yeah.
I've been looking for a theory of conservatism. There was no theory of conservatism. In fact, to this day, Josh, there still isn't a theory of conservatism. I mean, dirty little secret here.
Yeah.
You're going to give somebody the theory of conservatism, what are you going to assign to them? Russell Kirk?
And many of the most distinguished conservatives like Edmund Burke were anti-theoretical or just atheoretical.
So I thought this was a rational conservatism, and it was more radical than that. But that's how I got into it. And it was in debating with this professor. He and I would meet at the student union, and I would ask a bunch of questions, and he would give me answers. And that was about 6 or 9 months of those private conversations when I finally started to wonder if, hey, wait a second, maybe I am a libertarian. And by the time I was a senior, I organized a student-organized seminar for credit in my residential college in which I taught libertarianism using several texts that people might or might not recognize. And so I taught a seminar on libertarianism by my senior year of college.
So what was it about libertarianism and those discussions with Professor Cody?
Yes.
That made it so magnetic for you, or so persuasive for you, is a better term for it. I mean, was it the focus on liberty, on individualism, on rights?
Liberty. It was on liberty. I mean, look, I was again, my overriding concern then and now is justice, and inherent or as a part of that is liberty. Even the Aristotelian Thomist view values liberty because you need to choose to be good. You need to choose it. And it's also, as Henry Veach used to describe, the good life is somewhat of a do-it-yourself affair. You need to be virtuous and you need not to follow the vices, but those are very abstract. There's a lot of particularities in your life. You can't there's not a rule book that you just have to follow mechanistically or formalistically. It's his phrase, it's a do-it-yourself affair. And so that's all about liberty. And so, yes, I was always a liberty-based conservative. There are liberty-based conservatives and there are tradition-based conservatives. And I was a liberty-based conservative. So was my dad, who became a libertarian under my influence. And so now I see a more systematic description of what a liberty theory is. I think this is a rational conservatism. I then came to believe it was something different than conservatism. At any rate, that's what was the appeal. It was liberty, it was justice, and part of the story that I heard was rights. Now, not every libertarian believes in natural rights. There were a lot of utilitarian libertarians. David Friedman, for example, Milton Friedman's son, who wrote The Machinery of Freedom, one of the books I used in my course. He's a utilitarian. He's not a natural rights person. Murray Rothbard was a natural rights person. Ayn Rand, who I got to see one time in person, was a natural rights person. And so that, because I came out of the natural law Thomist idea, adding natural rights to it seemed like a natural fit.
Yeah. Okay, so it sounds like the way this worked, I'm just trying to get the pattern of ideas as well as, in young Randy's mind, sort of how these ideas computed. It sounds like you thought that people had a sort of both a generically human nature and an individual nature, and realizing the best potentialities in their nature was how they would flourish. And then you came to see that the precondition for them fulfilling their own nature was a high degree of liberty. And so you started to transition from a theory of human flourishing, which philosophers would call ethics, to a theory of politics, which was libertarian.
Correct.
Is that fair?
Yeah, I mean, my view today, when I teach this, and I taught natural rights to my students in Con Law 2 on Tuesday, is that natural rights address the issue of how society should be structured. Natural law, ethics, addresses the question of how we should live our life. Natural rights addresses the question of how should society be structured so as that people can live a good life. And so natural rights defined the boundary and space within which people can exercise and adhere to the natural law. That is the relationship between the two.
So you toy with the idea briefly of going to get a philosophy PhD.
Correct.
And decide against it, not least because of how John Veach got drummed out of Henry Veach, got drummed out of Northwestern.
Correct.
In really sordid circumstance,
Yes.
not on his part, but
No.
on the
He took the aid of
academia's
some
part.
graduate students who were being coerced to have sex with, some male graduate students who were being coerced to have sex with male professors. And the graduate students came to Henry for relief. He was a very conventional liberal Democrat and a nationally prominent philosopher. And the department closed ranks around the professors who were being accused, and eventually made life so miserable for Henry that he felt he had to leave. He went to Georgetown, where he became chair of the philosophy department until his retirement. And then he left me there after my sophomore year, and I hooked up with some other philosophers at that point.
Yeah, but just seeing the nastiness and the
I
injustice of his departure made you feel like academia is a snake pit.
Yeah, academia is too dirty a business. I would prefer to go into the criminal justice system in Cook County, Illinois.
Yeah, and you had a daydream since childhood of being a prosecutor in Cook County, Illinois. And so you went off to Harvard Law School after doing great on the LSAT. So this once again opened up possibilities for you that hadn't been there before. And you went off to Harvard Law School planning to be a prosecutor. And one thing I was struck by in your book—
I will say, I want to be a criminal lawyer, and whether I was a prosecutor or public defender was a little less fixed in advance.
Okay.
I mean, at some point during law school, I went over and thought more that I would be a prosecutor, and that's what I wanted to be. Although if I had gotten the right job in the right public defender's office, I might have done that, but that wasn't really on offer. The public defender's office in Cook County was very corrupt. I mean, not monetarily corrupt, but you had to have political clout to get the job and to rise. The
Right.
prosecutor's office, which was at that time under a Republican state's attorney, was very merit-based. I could get a job and I could rise, and I did rise based on merit. And so if I had no other reason for preference, that's what would lead me to be a prosecutor anyway.
Let's start a little earlier here with going to Harvard Law School. So, most people watching this will assume, here's this guy who is endowed chair professor at Georgetown Law School and has written all these famous books and tried cases before the Supreme Court. You must have been one of the stars of law school upon arrival. That's going to be the assumption. Let's disabuse them of that assumption. It actually sounds like coming to law school was a tough time for you. Law school didn't come naturally. I found your letter to your parents and your grandparents about Harvard Law School in your first year one of the most moving parts of your entire book, actually, about how you felt like your character was being co-opted and you had to resist.
I wrote that letter after my first day of classes.
After your first day. Wow. It was a very moving letter. And you had, throughout your life, cultivated close mentors who really taught you a lot and helped watch out for you in your career, and that kind of fell flat in law school. It didn't work out.
I tried, and I was rejected.
Yeah, on ideological grounds, very likely ideological
as it turned
grounds.
out, yeah.
And it sounds like that was, and your performance was not outstanding. It was fine, but it wasn't outstanding.
Maybe fine. Grading on a curve.
Yeah. So talk about that a little bit. You're not going to be the only one who had struggles in law school. I actually remember, just a quick anecdote. I went to Yale Law School, made law review, which is not as big a deal as one might think from other law schools. But I didn't get selected for a major position on the editorial board. I got selected for a really minor position. And this sounds so trivial in retrospect, but at the time I was upset. And I happened to go to class that day in constitutional theory with Bruce Ackerman. And Bruce Ackerman talked about getting rejected from the journal at Yale Law School and how he felt like his dream of being an academic was stillborn and his career was going to tank and all was lost. And then he talked about how, as you get a little further in life and you start to have some successes, you just don't have to talk publicly about the failures and disappointments along the way. But actually, almost everyone, including you and me and him, have these major failures along the way or major disappointments or setbacks. So can you talk a little bit about your law school experience?
Sure. And I should say, Bruce Ackerman has been very good to me. And he's given me some great career advice over the years.
Me too.
Even though one of my last encounters with him was to participate in an Ackerman symposium at Yale in which I explained why his entire enterprise is misbegotten. When he was there in the room and everybody else was there too.
And I want to just pause over this.
And he's a liberal. He likes argument.
So I want to just pause over this for a moment, because as you've taken your walk through the world and as you describe it in this book, there are people who are very biased against you on ideological grounds, but there are also exceptions, and the exceptions are really noteworthy. And Bruce Ackerman's an exception. Ronald Dworkin is an exception. These are people who are capable of caring about
Alan
you.
Dershowitz was an exception.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I had exactly the same experience, even with some of the same people, Bruce Ackerman among them. So I think it's important to pay tribute to those people who are not biased.
Bruce is full of himself, as many of us are, but when he sees a young person, at the time I was at Chicago Kent when I first met him, and I was visiting at Harvard Law School, and he was giving a workshop, and I showed up for this workshop. And my book, The Structure of Liberty, Justice and the Rule of Law, had just been published by Oxford. And I walked up and I introduced myself to him, and he goes, "Oh yeah, I know your book, I know your book." And then he said, "We liberals have to stick together." That was the first thing Bruce Ackerman ever said to me.
Wow.
While I was a junior professor at Chicago Kent. And that's kind of been the attitude he's taken to me ever since.
Yeah.
And so, I don't agree with his project, and I've explained why in the Yale Law Journal, but I mean, he's a true liberal.
He told me once that he fought hard to bring you to Yale Law School, and it wasn't successsul, but he told me that, knowing that I know you.
And I've never heard that before, that he did. But it wouldn't surprise me given our relationship. And it disappoints me, and I can imagine why it didn't work, but I'll only imagine why it didn't work. Anyway.
So let's talk about law school a little bit.
Yeah, so I was not a great law student. I didn't quite get what you needed to do. I didn't understand what it would take to be a good law student, until I was a law professor grading exams. And then I started reading them. And then I realized I didn't know anything about how to write an exam answer. I just didn't know. And I didn't know how to study because I didn't, to the extent you're studying so you can achieve on an exam, you have to study in such a way as you can succeed. And I didn't do that either. I was in resistance mode. I thought I was being indoctrinated. I was trying to figure out what was wrong with what my professors were saying. That's not the right attitude. You need to suspend your disbelief. Don't worry about disagreeing with them or the fact they're trying to indoctrinate you. Try to figure out what they think. Because actually, that's what you're supposed to put on the exam, what they think about the subject. And besides, you're better off. You will get your money's worth if you know what they think, if you learn the subject. I didn't approach it that way. I didn't know to. And so I did not do very well on my exams.
It also, not to interject, but it also sounds like you weren't that diligent.
Well, I didn't know what it meant to be diligent. I had no as a college student, I wasn't that diligent either, and yet I got where I got. And I didn't know what it took. I didn't know what I was supposed to do. I mean, I read, I didn't brief my cases. I book briefed them. It wasn't until I taught contracts for the first time in my first year of teaching when I realized I got to brief these cases. I had to brief every single case I taught or I wouldn't have understood it. Now I know why I was supposed to brief cases back then, because if I had briefed cases as a student, I'd have walked into class and I would have understood what they were saying. Because I didn't brief them, I was kind of lost.
Yeah.
Anyway, I was not a good student. But what I did do, which has proven to have value, and I'm not justifying being a bad student by that, but I wrote a fan letter to Murray Rothbard before I started law school, and saying and was big letter about how much of an influence he had on me. And then I said, maybe sometime when I'm on the East Coast, we'll have a chance to meet. And rather than write back to me right away, although he did write back to me eventually, he gave a copy of the letter to somebody else who was a first-year law student, John Hagel. And he was not in my section, but he called me up and we had met for coffee in Harvard Yard and in Harvard Square. And he was the president of the Center for Libertarian Studies in New York, which was a nonprofit educational institution with all of these prominent libertarian intellectuals on the board. And he took me down to New York to listen to a lecture by Leonard Liggio at Fordham. And in the audience was Murray Rothbard, Leonard's closest friend. And I ended up with Murray Rothbard's living room that night. And the two of us were firing off all the hypotheticals that our torts professors were tormenting us with. And turns out Murray couldn't answer them any better than we could, which was actually a light bulb moment for me. But I ultimately got very involved in this group. And I was my second semester, I was asked to be on the board of directors, and we had board meetings. Our offices were on Union Square in New York, so I spent a lot of time in New York. We organized Libertarian Scholars Conferences, a Journal of Libertarian Studies. So rather than studying what I was supposed to be studying in law school, I was quite involved in the libertarian intellectual movement. I wrote articles that were published in the Journal of Libertarian Studies, at least two, and so I had that intellectual life. Outside of law school. It didn't necessarily help me get a teaching job, but it really did. I was developing my intellectual positions right during law school.
So that's an amazing part of the story, because here you are going to Harvard Law School, but also part of this group of historically important thinkers at the Center for Libertarian Studies, and sort of taking a major intellectual and administrative position in this coalition of major libertarian thinkers. Actually, reading about it reminded me of reading about Cambridge in the days of Russell and Keynes and Wittgenstein, or late 19th century America in the days of Holmes and Pierce and James, where you get these collections of people who together build something that is greater than any of the individuals could have built alone. It's sort of a collection of like-minded people who create something really lasting and remarkable together. And this is the first of the two big intellectual movements you've been part of. This is the sort of version of libertarianism that was built on a theoretical level and a policy level in the 1970s.
Correct.
And then enters into politics in a big way in the 1980s with Reagan and many people in Reagan's administration, and
Correct.
Thatcher and many people in Thatcher's administration. Can you tell us a little bit about the people, the ideas, the atmosphere, what it was like to be part of something that was going to be that big before any of you knew it was going to be that big?
Well, we thought we were completely, marginal and obscure. We had no idea that we would become big, and a lot of people don't. A lot of us don't even realize how big we became. It's the NatCons. If you go to the NatCon convention, which I did go, their first NatCon convention here, and you find every 20 or 30 minutes they're attacking libertarians because libertarians run the world. And I'm sitting there thinking, oh, we do. I mean, I guess so. I mean, that sounds like good news to me.
You didn't realize you had won?
I didn't realize I'd won. And I think on reflection, I think they're not entirely wrong about this. And even though we're not talking at all about the crazy Libertarian Party, which I was foolish enough to like the idea of when it first started. And I went to the Libertarian Party National Convention in New York in 1980. Nozick was there on the floor making amendments, making for the platform, and Rothbard was there. Ed Crane was there. That was but after that, I turned against the party, the existence of such a party. I think in the American two-party system, it's a negative, not a positive. Even if it were not crazy, even if it were serious, it would be a negative, not a positive. For two reasons. We have a two-party system, first past the post, and they're going to a third party is going to cost the major party that's closest to them votes.
Right.
That's counterproductive. That's irrational. To have a party that's going to cost the party closest to you votes, and it drains out of the major parties people who are of libertarian mind. And so that at the margin makes each of the major parties less libertarian than if those people were in those parties. Those are the reasons I'm against it. And then they're crazy in addition to that. But anyway, it was wonderful to be a part of this. We really felt like it was a very exciting time. And I just want to flash forward here a little bit because I don't know how much time we'll have. I now believe that the model that we developed, which was very, very robust, unlike originalism, has somewhat been frozen in amber since the 80s because the infrastructure that we had went away. What we were doing was within an infrastructure provided by the Center for Libertarian Studies, the Libertarian Studies conferences and the journal, and that went away. And there no longer was an intellectual infrastructure to develop the idea. There was Cato and IHS and other groups, but they were not actually developing the theory of libertarianism. As a result, it stopped developing. Now, I contrast that with the originalism movement that I've been part of since the 1990s. I became an originalist officially in 1999. And this is a movement, because of the Federalist Society, it has an intellectual structure in which we can fight things out and disagree with each other. And as a result of that, the model keeps getting more and more robust. It changes. My own views on originalism have changed as a result of interactions with other people within the movement. Libertarianism did not benefit from that kind of development. And I think therefore, it's in need of upgrades. It's in need of improvement. And when I'm done with my book on being a criminal prosecutor in Chicago, fighting crime and corruption in Chicago, my next book is going to be about updating libertarianism beyond the model that I was partly responsible for developing in the 1980s.
Okay, I've got to pause here to say that the fact that at 72, you're updating a model that you made famous and influential in the 1980s speaks so well of your openness to ideas and experiences. I know very few people like that. Most people I know, they kind of figure out what they think sometime in their, let's say, 40s and 50s, and they never change again. However, the world changes around them. And I've always known you to be a person who is observing the world around him and reacting to it and perfectly ready to reconsider his views. And the reconsideration might not go to something as foundational as your love for liberty. That's part of your basic character, but how you realize that love of liberty, what it implies for politics, is open to revision. And so I just want to voice my admiration for that.
I really appreciate you saying that, Josh. It really means a lot. I think libertarians need to get more serious about individual freedom, basically. Which is ironic. And the conditions of individual freedom, but also they have to understand the value of individual freedom, which would require them to take a more natural law, Thomistic approach to human flourishing, which is something libertarians have rebelled against doing. Many of them, not all of them. I have fellow travelers that agree with me, but many of them have rebelled against taking a stand on morals and ethics. And I think that's essential to a properly fleshed out libertarianism. So it does actually come back to that as well.
Also essential, by the way, to a a version of libertarianism that will be persuasive to people who think that this is a philosophy that doesn't give them compassion or doesn't give them the full panoply of sort of moral demands that they think the world places on us as individuals.
Yeah,
society.
and we have to take more seriously the idea of man being a social animal.
Yeah.
I know Aristotle said political animal, but I'm prepared to say, social animal for sure. But this is not a podcast about that. But since you raised my immersion in the development of the libertarian model, I think it's only right for me to point out that I think that model has been stuck. And there's a lot of libertarians, I think, out there who instinctively feel the same way. Many of them don't call themselves libertarian anymore because they have moved beyond the model that we're stuck at. And I just think libertarianism needs to take liberty more seriously.